It's now been 10 years since Dying Light was originally released on the PS4 and Xbox One consoles. A whole decade of gaming has gone by, yet Dying Light remains a game that is often spoke about in high regards and in some circles considered better than its 2022 sequel. I want to go back and give the game a playthrough to see what it's all about. See, I never played the game all those years ago when it first released, but I've seen and read some good things and also some bad things about it, and I want to see for myself, as a newcomer to the series, what the game is all about. Dying Light was not Techland's first foray into the survival horror genre. The same studio developed Dead Island, which I think can be fittingly compared to Dying Light's much less serious sibling. That game sold over 5 million copies, proving to Techland that the formula of a zombie-killing, open-world action RPG that can even be played cooperatively is the perfect recipe for success. Dying Light would go on to release in 2015 and sell over 20 million copies to date. That's definitely a resounding success. With that bit of setup complete, let's get into my review. Dying Light takes place in a fictional Middle Eastern city named Haran. This city serves sort of as a ground zero for an outbreak of a rabies-like virus that has caused the population of the city to become infected and turn into more or less zombies. You play the role of Crane, a GRE agent who's been sent in to recover a top-secret file, while also serving as a runner among the two factions in the city in an attempt to fit in and not draw any attention towards yourself. The city is filled with a large cast of characters, most of which are forgettable outside of a few standouts of the bunch. Quickly, the story turns into a struggle of morality, often leading Crane into making choices that will harm the surviving citizens of Haran or jeopardize his standing with the GRE. The story was overall pretty good. The main villain in the game is solid. Rise gives me that vibe that I get from Voss from Far Cry 3, but not as iconic as that performance was, which I feel like that's clearly what Dying Light was attempting to go for with their villain. The plot was easy enough to follow and it developed at a fairly steady pace, with the constant introduction to new characters and different locations. Now, to be clear, there aren't any choices you can make to alter the plot in any way. The story is linear through and through. But all in all, the story was good enough for me and kept me engaged all the way to the end. What makes Dying Light stand out amongst the crowd is the movement system that's ingrained in it. The city is designed with parkour in mind, and it's a mechanic that works decently well given what would otherwise be an awkward experience to execute in a first-person perspective. Movement from building to building is fluid when on the run, but when climbing is involved, things can get a bit finicky. There were countless times where I missed obvious grabbable ledges despite looking right at them and timing my jump accordingly. That being said, I was pretty surprised at how well the system worked overall. Now, full disclosure, I am playing the game 10 years after release, and I'm sure it's gone under countless updates, so maybe the parkour wasn't as fluid on release, but given my experience, I found it to be a nice addition that made getting around more fun, and it did not feel like a gimmick that was tacked on for marketing purposes. This city is chock full of infected, and early on it's advised that it would be best to stick to the rooftop and higher ground in general to avoid clusters of infected that could cause quite a bit of damage if taken lightly. I followed this rule as much as I could during my traversal, but mistimed jumps or weakly planned routing had me plunging to the floor and getting surrounded by infected rather quickly. This brings me to melee. Melee combat in Dying Light is top tier, of course given the experience the devs had from Dead Island and carrying over much of that game's melee mechanics. Dying Light was able to evolve the existing melee system and perfect it. Hits register with a satisfying impact, maiming enemies in ways I didn't even think were possible. Different weapons carry different weight in their swings. A heavy rebar hammer or axe will swing slower but inflict chunkier damage. A machete will make swift swings and chop up an enemy effectively. Limbs can go flying, heads can be smashed in, or completely sliced off. There is a very expressive gore system in place that I liked quite a bit. Enemies react to hits in satisfying ways, and sliding by and tripping an enemy only to stomp their brains in became one of my favorite combos to pull off in the game. The flow of combat is fully in your control, since most infected will slowly stumble towards you, allowing you to time and aim your attacks for maximum damage. I'll have a separate section for gear and gear customization later because that's quite a large part of the game. Just to reiterate though, the melee combat in Dying Light is extremely responsive and satisfying and was one of my favorite parts of the game. Let's quickly swap over and talk about gunplay because to my surprise there are guns in the game. I went in thinking the game would be a strictly melee experience, but about halfway through I picked up my first assault rifle. Now my first thought when picking up a gun in the game was, Okay, that kinda ruined the vibe of the game for me, and I'll explain. One of my most memorable moments of the game was going through a school at night with zombies wailing and screaming all over the place, and getting rushed by a random zombie here and there was genuinely scary, given the atmosphere and sounds. Only equipped with a melee weapon, I knew I had to take them head on. Fast forward to when I picked up my first assault rifle, I instantly felt unstoppable, a feeling that I did not have at any moment prior. Of course, I could have a self-enforced rule to use only melee weapons, but I want to use what the game gave me. With that being said, the actual gunplay in the game is pretty average. I didn't find using a gun to be all that fun. I didn't feel like different guns had much distinction between them. You get your standard assortment of pistols, rifles, and shotguns, but none of them were really that satisfying to use the same way melee weapons were. There are a ton of weapons in Dying Light, and that feature had been a main selling point prior to the game's release. The ability to take any mundane melee weapon, modified in a number of ways, is a system introduced by Dead Island and iterated on by Dying Light, and quite successfully, I might add. It's worth noting that the game does have a color-coded rarity system, with the main stats of an item like damage and durability being the main properties that increase as a weapon rarity goes up. I really liked being able to take a weapon and adding one of the few different elements like electric damage, bleeding, poison, or fire. It's a cool system because there are varying degrees of how much of an impact that added property will do based on the recipe you're using to craft that set property. By the end of the game, I was wielding a machete that was so good, I was slicing up most infected with 1 or 2 hits, as opposed to the normal 4 or 5 hits that most would take. One downside is that your weapons do eventually break beyond repair. You can add mods to give your weapon more durability, and each weapon does come with a standard number of repairs, but eventually your favorite weapon will no longer be usable. I'm not a big fan of those types of systems. A comparison would be something like Breath of the Wild, where I find a cool sword only to learn that I can't use it forever due to it breaking over time. My philosophy in gaming has always been, if I find a cool item, I want to have that item forever, which unfortunately is not possible in Dying Light. With that being said though, the whole customization system is very well done, and it allows you to make some powerful combinations. Leveling in Dying Light is something akin to Skyrim. It's one of those games that has a system where the more you use an ability, the more XP you earn for it. In Dying Light, there are 3 different skill trees that are leveled differently. The Survivor skill line is leveled by completing main missions, side quests, and saving random citizens in need of help, and other activities. The Agility skill line is leveled by simply parkouring around the city, and the Power skill tree is leveled by taking part in combat. I did like this system quite a bit because it gave me control of how powerful and skilled I want to be. If my melee was feeling weak, then I'd go bash in some heads, and once I did that enough, I'd pick my next skill within that tree. What I like most about these skill trees is that the actual abilities you unlock are very helpful and impactful. Some upgrades grant you a new move to add to your repertoire, others grant you an ability to craft new throwables, and you can even unlock a grapple hook. After maxing out one of the skill trees at level 25, you get access to the legend rank skill tree, which allows you to add extra points to certain damage types and other properties. This progression system was well done, and I felt like I was definitely becoming more stronger and more smart with the resources I was acquiring to really maximize how much damage I was able to deal. The city of Haran is a deadly place. Roam anywhere outside of a marked safe zone, and within seconds you'll find yourself fighting or running for your life. Thankfully, the open world Techland has created is filled to the brim with an abundance of resources that help you even the fight. Scavenging houses, storefronts, and vehicles for loot becomes a way of life in the city. The crafting materials picked up can craft a huge list of different items and consumables, and this list only gets larger once you include DLC items. More on that later. You can lockpick police cars and ambulances, as well as lock chests and rooms. These range from easy to very hard, and if you played Skyrim, you know exactly how the lockpicking mechanic works. It's not innovative in any way, but that's fine. The feeling of finding the exact crafting material I needed in order to make a medkit in a life or death situation felt like such a relief. The game is heavily reliant on this crafting mechanic, and thankfully it's well done. The variety of items you can create and the modifications to the combat to yourself some of these items make is pretty profound. The city also offers up different events that seem to happen dynamically. The GRE drops these random airdrops from time to time, and you have the option to go and fight for one of these drops, as they tend to contain valuable resources, but they are often surrounded by members of Rise's faction. There are tons of side objectives to complete. The quality of most of them is actually pretty decent, and along the way you'll meet new characters and be rewarded with either a new crafting recipe or a weapon for your troubles. The day-night cycle is a very important mechanic The daytime allows for mostly trouble-free travel. You might run into virals who chase you down, but they can be dealt with handedly. At night, this changes completely because the game introduces the volatile infected type. The game completely flips on its head, reversing your role of being the hunter to being the hunted. I actively avoided nighttime cycles. I was genuinely terrified of being chased down by volatiles. And it's not just one or two. If you attract enough attention, you can end up with a whole pack chasing you down. Without enough safe houses unlocked, a trek across the map at night is a recipe for disaster. On the plus side, nighttime gameplay doubles your experience points. So any actions you take that earn XP, like taking part in combat or parkouring around, levels you twice as fast. So there's a good incentive to stick around at night. About midway through the game, my arsenal of weapons and my abilities had evolved to the point where going out at night no longer posed a big threat, and having been equipped with various guns, I was able to pick off volatiles and other infected alike from a distance. I like the day-night cycle dynamic quite a bit. The complete shift in playstyle made me adjust my approach when I had to go out at night. Apart from a few main missions and side quests, going out at night is completely optional, but as I mentioned previously, there's a really good incentive for doing so. Now the game does have a good amount of infected types. There are the run-of-the-mill biters who approach you slowly, and if you end up grabbed, then you have to perform a QTE event to get out of their grasp, though these zombies are generally easy to kill. Other common types include virals, who are recently infected humans that chase you down unless you break their line of sight, even in the daytime. Now I found these particular enemy types to be on the annoying side. Sometimes I just want to freely explore around without constantly being chased down, but these virals constantly spawn and you can end up with a group of them on your tail if you don't pick them off as they come around. Other infected include a goon, who are substantially harder to take down without any firepower. There are toads who spit bile at you from a distance. Not literal toads, but infected humans who kind of resemble one. Outside of that, you do have harder enemies like demolishers, but these are more rare and the encounters with them can last pretty long. Hands down though, the worst enemy type has to be the bomber. These dudes just explode when you get near them, but the devs sneakily placed these guys in hidden areas, essentially causing instant death when I least expected it. I did not like those guys at all. You also have screamers who attract zombies to your locations, and the night cycle does have its own set of enemies. These include different types of volatiles and bolters, and there are also human enemies, and these come in really two variations. Either you'll be fighting them through melee or from a distance with some firepower. The city of Haran is split into two distinct districts that are traveled to via the sewer system. The actual design of the city is something I found to be very well done. The skyline is detailed with skyscrapers with smoke billowing out. Storefronts are ravaged, safe zones are fenced in with barbed wire and drenched in UV light. Survivors set up safe houses high up in buildings where the infected can't get to. Stormy weather comes and goes, with the rain adding to the already hopeless atmosphere. Trees sway with the wind. The sunrise and sunset bring with them a sense of safety or a sense of dread. The game establishes the atmosphere from the get-go, essentially telling the player that what they're in for is not going to be pretty. Dying Light is a dark, gritty, and intense game that is even downright terrifying at times. The first-person perspective adds to the formula, sort of like a variable in an equation that equates to the final answer being pure adrenaline. A game that brings out that sort of response out of me is pretty rare. Dying Light had me captivated for much of my playthrough. The city is just very well designed, with a parkour system at the forefront. Hundreds if not thousands of grabbable ledges exist to make your traversal more accessible. I rarely ever had trouble going from point A to point B, as finding my path to my next objective was always a breeze. Now let's talk about the updates and DLC. This is going to be one of the longer sections of the review for good reason, as Dying Light has went under so many updates and so much additional DLC has been added to the game that it teeters on being ridiculous in a good way. So I bought the enhanced edition, I think, and it came with a ton of DLC bundles, none of which I used during my playthrough, as I wanted my experience to be as close to vanilla as possible. So let me start with the paid expansions. First up, there was the Cuisine and Cargo. This added 2 quarantine zones, which are basically areas you can enter and clear the infestation in for a big reward. This second expansion, named the Bozak Horde, is a cooperative mode where you travel to Haran Stadium to take on different challenges. The following was the third paid expansion, and this particular one was the largest, as it added a whole new map, story, as well as adding some new weapons and blueprints, and they even added a buggy you can use, so I guess some people were getting tired of parkouring around. Hell Raid is the final paid expansion, which was added 5 years after release back in 2020. This DLC features a game mode where you fight hordes of skeletons as you improve your Hell Raid rank to unlock new weapons and items. There has also been 10 free DLCs, otherwise known as content drops, that add various content to the game like new enemies, new game modes such as prison heist, new ammo types, new outfits for Crane, and new weapons as well. There are also a number of bundles released like the Retro Wave pack that adds new weapons and outfits. The amount of free content the game has received is pretty wild, and all the DLC support, both paid and free, is fantastic. They even added a Be the Zombie mode, so if a player has online play enabled, you can raid their game as a volatile during nighttime. Of course, outside of content drops, there have been actual patches. The one that most likely matters to you most is the next gen patch for Xbox Series X and PS5, which dropped back in 2022. This added a performance mode that gets 60 FPS in Full HD, which is 1080p, another balanced mode which targets 60 FPS in 1440p, and finally a 4K 30 FPS mode. This section is finally over, but if you find the game on sale, make sure you get the enhanced edition so you can reap the benefits of all these different bundles. So let's wrap this up. My 35 hours with Dying Light were fun. I enjoyed the atmosphere and the city of Iran quite a lot. The game never really faltered for me. Much of my playthrough was very enjoyable. I will mention towards the final few missions of the game, I was feeling a bit of fatigue, and I found the final mission itself to be overly frustrating at times. Despite that, it would be very hard for me not to recommend a playthrough of Dying Light, given the amount of content updates and patches it's received in the decade it's been released. The melee combat is great. Tense moments that sneaking around at night or finding myself in the sewers brings are feelings that games never really bring out for me. The story is decent enough, and not something that will blow your mind, but was enough to keep me engaged until the credits roll. Of course, in the case of Dying Light, the gameplay is the bread and butter, and all the various systems at play, from the parkour, crafting, to the combat, are all pretty well done. The game frankly does not show its age. Even being a decade old, graphically the game looked good, and even better than some titles that are coming out this day and age. I genuinely and thoroughly enjoyed my time with Dying Light and fully recommend a playthrough of the game for anyone even considering it. So that wraps up my review of Dying Light. Thank you all for watching. As always, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you all in the next one.